Hi there, Why Religion listeners. Professor Anthony Sweat here from BYU Church History and Doctrine. Welcome to another great episode of the Why Religion podcast. Over my many years of teaching, I've heard a lot of different questions surrounding church doctrine. Some general questions I hear go something like this. If God is unchanging and truth is eternal, then why have some of the church's teachings changed over time? Or maybe questions like this. Why don't we still teach, fill in the blank of whatever teaching it is, like the early church taught? Were they wrong for teaching that, or are we wrong since that emphasis has now gone away? Or this is one of my personal favorites. I once heard that, fill in the name of a general authority here, said that, fill in a reported teaching here, so that makes it church doctrine, right? Well, is that how doctrine is determined? How can we differentiate between an official position of the church and an individual opinion of one of its leaders? How do we handle statements by general authorities from the past that may seem to contradict current ones in the present? These and many other questions often come up surrounding church doctrine. In 2016, it were these kind of questions that led myself, together with my church history and doctrine colleagues, Michael Hubbard McKay and Garrett Dirkmott, to write an article proposing models and giving a framework to evaluate Latter-day Saint doctrine. My church history and doctrine colleague, Professor Michael Goodman, has recently published an article reviewing metrics and models that have been proposed over the years about church doctrine, and importantly, has studied how the church itself has adjusted and refined its own use of the word doctrine over time. Professor Goodman's research looked at over 2,000 instances of the word doctrine by church leaders over the last 30 to 40 years, looking for patterns.
What I began to recognize was whether they were being systematic about it or not. What came for the last 30 to 40 years was basically three criteria. One is this teaching something that we consider to be eternal? Eternality is the word I use for it. Two, is it being taught regularly by the First Presidency and Quorum of 12? And three, is it salvific? Meaning, does it have to do with our salvation? And I began to notice this again and again and again.
In today's episode, Professor Michael Goodman takes us into his research on the frameworks, nuances, and findings surrounding the discussion on defining church doctrine. This is Why Religion.
Each year, religion professors at Brigham Young University produce hundreds of publications on subjects related to the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. This podcast brings this research into one place to enlighten the everyday seeker of truth.
Seek learning, even by study and also by faith.
Interviewing the author, we discuss why the study was done, why it matters, and why the professor chooses to be both a scholar and a disciple. This is Why Religion. Research to enlighten your mind.
Recently, Professor Ryan Sharp from BYU Ancient Scripture sat down with his colleague, Professor Michael Goodman of BYU Church History and Doctrine, to talk about his 2021 article called "Oh Say What Is Truth? Approaches to Doctrine," published by BYU Studies. In part one, we like to look at why the author did this study. And here, Dr. Goodman will key off the title of his article to explore what is meant by truth. He also provides a definition of doctrine and speaks to three criterion of doctrine from his analysis of church leader usage of the phrase. He will also address what about some of the teachings that don't quite fit so cleanly into these definitions or criteria. So here in part one is Professor Sharp interviewing Professor Michael Goodman.
We're here to discuss a recent article that you published entitled, "Oh, Say What Is Truth? Approaches to Doctrine." And I thought it might be helpful to maybe just dive in with what was the genesis of this project? What led you to write this article?
Thanks, Ryan. I've had very strong feelings about this for a lot of years. I've been a religious educator for 33 years. seminaries, institutes, BYU, and of course our task is to help our students come to Christ, understand what truth is, and know how to recognize that. So that's always been an important issue. About 11 years ago, I was called to serve on the church's material evaluation committee, which is what most people would call the correlation committee. Well, our whole task is to evaluate teachings to see whether they're true or false, doctrine or not. And we have no power. I don't want to intimate that, but we have to prepare ourselves. And so it led to a decade-long formal study that I've used in teaching and as well as in writing a little bit up until this point. And finally, I basically did a systematic review that led to what we're looking at today.
Wow, and we're fortunate that you did, because it's really helpful, and I'm anxious for our listeners to get some of the insights from this work. In the introduction to the article, you actually begin with the lyrics to the hymn, "Oh, Say What Is Truth." I'm not sure if you have the lyrics there handy, but I'd love it if you do. If you would maybe read a couple of the verses that you selected, and then maybe just comment on why that hymn resonates and how you feel it encapsulates the message of this article.
Happy to. The two verses that I chose were these: "Yes, say what is truth, 'tis the brightest prize, to which mortals or gods can aspire. Go search in the depth where it glittering lies, or ascend in pursuit to the loftiest skies. 'Tis an aim for the noblest desire. And then say what is truth, 'tis the last and the first, for the limit of time it steps o'er. Though the heavens depart and the earth's fountains burst, truth, the sum of existence, will weather the worst, eternal, unchanged, evermore." As I looked at that and as I thought about it, what this hymn does is what I believe in a very healthy way conflates the concept of truth with the concept of God. Notice the line, "'Tis the last, 'tis the first." You might recognize that from scriptural language speaking about God. Eternal, unchanged, evermore. And so you'll notice as we go forward in our discussion today that I believe that there's an inextricable connection between God and truth. And I thought this encapsulated that beautifully.
Yeah, well said. And in fact, the next statement, I guess it's in the next paragraph, you write, "Canonized scripture portrays truth as co-eternal with God. Church theology has long held that there is a reciprocal, interdependent relationship between God and truth." So with that, let's launch in from there. Can you walk our listeners through some of these passages that you alluded to and maybe give us a sense of this pattern where you see this kind of co-eternal nature of God and truth together in Scripture?
Yeah, absolutely. The Book of Mormon does something very interesting. It equates God's godhood with his living true to truth or eternal law. As you and I know in the scriptures, both in Alma and in Ether, it says, Lord, I know that thou speakest truth, for thou art a God of truth. And speaks of if God were ever to go contrary to the nature of God, nature of truth, that he would cease to be God. Now that's a profound statement making that connection. Then if you go to Doctrine and Covenants 93, it speaks about truth as a name for God. And I thought that's profound. In verses 8 and 9, it says, "Therefore in the beginning the Word was, for he was the Word," obviously speaking of Christ, "even the messenger of salvation." Verse 9, "the light and the Redeemer of the world, the Spirit of truth." And the connection, I think, as you go through the scriptures, you see that God is the only being who is capable of knowing all truth. Therefore, if we would know truth in its fullness, it is only knowable in relationship to God. And that's the construct I was trying to get at there.
Yeah, very well said. Thank you. And then in the next section, you connect to truth and then introduce this idea of doctrine and talk about the role of prophets. And so let's jump to that now. In it, you write, "Latter-day Saints differ from most other Christians in believing that God continues to reveal truth to living prophets. Joseph Smith stated that it is through this priesthood or prophetic channel that all knowledge, doctrine, the plan of salvation, and every important truth is revealed from heaven." Maybe unpack that and theological implications that you see as we talk about truth and the role of prophets.
Thank you. Absolutely. So if God is the ultimate source of truth, and if truth cannot be fully understood without God, then we have to ask ourselves, where and how does God give that truth to us? Which, of course, we would hopefully turn towards the concept of revelation. And even God himself, the script, it's been said about God, Bruce R. McConkie actually said that God either stands revealed or stands concealed. I'm using my own words there. In other words, that you cannot know God if he doesn't reveal himself. Well, if that's true, the question becomes, how does God reveal himself to us? And I'd hope we would understand that there's at least two mechanisms for that. One would be personal revelation, but the other is through prophetic revelation. And so prophets aren't the arbiters of truth, and yet prophets are the ones whom God is revealing truth to. Therefore, we basically come to understand truth as God reveals it through his prophets, which leads to a couple very important questions and issues. We in the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints don't believe in prophetic infallibility. We don't believe that prophets are perfect. And so we have multiple statements from prophets who are making that statement themselves. It's not just us making that. And yet you have statements like Joseph saying, yet there's no error in the revelations that I've given. And Wilford Woodruff's famous statement that God would not allow us to lead the people astray. And so you have to take both of these strands and pull them together and say, okay, we don't believe in prophetic infallibility, yet we believe that God works through prophets and expects us to heed and understand the words of those prophets. And so prophets become a very important means by which we can discern truth, which only God is able to reveal.
And that sort of leads to, I mean, really the bulk of this study that you've done, where you talk about the definition of doctrine, and in some circles, doctrine is just synonymous with a teaching, right? This is a doctrine, it's a teaching. And yet in the article you write, defining doctrine as simply any religious instruction leaves many modern members unable to differentiate between a teaching that's considered authoritative and a teaching that is simply the best understanding of a person speaking. And that leads to your analysis of various ways that you've seen many of these church leaders define doctrine and ways that they've tried to help members gain a better understanding of this. So with that, I'm going to kind of set you loose to take us whatever direction you want, and maybe give us the backdrop. You mentioned this is a study that you've been doing for a number of years. Kind of take us through that. How what did that study look like, and what were some of your findings?
Thank you. Absolutely. I think what you said is so crucial, Ryan, is that we understand that the definition of doctrine has varied from the days of Adam till today. For most of religious history, at least in Christian history, and most of the restored Gospels history, doctrine literally meant teaching, as you said. It didn't talk about it, didn't necessarily mean authoritative or not authoritative. It was simply a religious teaching. But about 30, 40, almost 40 years now ago, there began to be some very distinct changes in how the brethren spoke about doctrine. That caught my attention, and I thought, I wonder. So I began to look at systems that people had put together to understand what is doctrine, what is not in the church. And we'll talk a little bit about some of the other systems going forward, but I realized the reality is if we wanted to know how God is defining doctrine, if God does that through and with his prophets, we needed to know what the prophets were saying.
I'm curious, you mentioned you sort of saw that shift and saw doctrine spoken about in maybe a new or unique way. What did you understand in that moment? Like what did you identify? Was there a shift? Was there something that led to it? Were there any explanations given at the time?
What I began to recognize was that defining doctrine as any teaching was simply not taking care of the needs of the members at the time. In other words, it left members wondering, well, wait, is this something I can hang my hat on? Is this a truth that is not going to change? Or is this something that maybe it was taught in the past, but it's going to be modified now and changed? And what I began to see was the brethren began to narrow the definition of doctrine to make it more usable, more helpful for members to be able to know what was happening, what they could depend on, what they could rely on.
Yeah.
So what I chose to do was do a systematic study of the word doctrine in general conference. So I using some of the wonderful tools we had, did a systematic study of every mention of the word doctrine from 1850 till today. And what I saw for the first majority of the time was that doctrine, even if it was defined, it was basically defined as teaching till about 30, 40 years ago. And then it began to become much more specific. And what I found was just in the last 30 plus years, there are over 2,000 references to the word doctrine in General Conference. And so I thought, I wonder if I can find patterns here. So I literally studied all 2,000 of the references. And as I did so, I did see a very clear pattern begin to emerge, ways that the brethren repeatedly defined doctrine, not just one person, but several people, and used different words. They weren't just copying from each other. And so what I began to recognize was whether they were being systematic about it or not, what came for the last 30 to 40 years was basically three criteria. One is this teaching something that we consider to be eternal? Eternality is the word I use for it. Two, is it being taught regularly by the First Presidency and Quorum of 12? And three, is it salvific? Meaning, does it have to do with our salvation? And I began to notice this again and again and again. And as I did, and I mean, I could pull out quotes and show you that it was just consistently spoken of. When I realized that, I began to use it as part of my own instruction in classes, not as my own system. One of the things I always tell my students, and I would say on this podcast, is that I don't think there's any such thing as the criteria for recognizing doctrine. There are several possible. This is the one that I found the brethren are continuing to speak of. And since I finished the study, they're continuing to speak on it and using the same exact three. And so what I found in that is that the three criteria, is it eternal? Meaning, when Adam was alive, would it be true then? How about when Christ was alive? How about when Joseph Smith was alive? How about Russell M. Nelson? If it changes, that doesn't mean that at the time it wasn't right, but it simply means you wouldn't hang the label doctrine on it.
It's not unchanging.
It's
clearly.
not unchanging.
Yeah.
That's exactly what it is. And so that became the most common referenced definition for doctrine. Doctrine is that which is eternal and doesn't change. Joseph Smith, Boyd K. Packer, Dieter F. Uchtdorf, Elder Anderson, just multiples saying the same thing. And that's helpful. They also often differentiated doctrine. They'd usually use two words, doctrine or principles. They almost always overlap those. And they would compare that to practices or procedures, policies or procedures, excuse me. And they juxtapose those. Doctrines and principles don't change. You can hang your hat on those. You can have faith in those. Policies and procedures not only might change, sometimes by prophetic revelation have to change. President Nelson's probably the greatest example of that, right? So with that, we look and say, okay, is this an issue that has been consistently taught from the beginning? And also, are the brethren actually claiming this is an eternal truth? The fact that someone says that doesn't necessarily make it true, but you can go back and do a little historical look and say, yeah, there's not been much variation in this from Adam and Eve forward. So that became important. Second criteria, united voice. This united voice of the First Presidency and Quorum 12, sorry, I meant to clarify that. I don't mean by that there has to be an official proclamation. But if you've got one person or one or two people who have a topic and they hit it and you don't have others of the First Presidency and Quorum 12 jumping on, that doesn't mean that what they're saying is false, but it doesn't have the added verification that we would expect from Doctrine and Covenants 107, that all decisions of these quorums should be unanimous, right? When you have something that the First Presidency and Quorum of 12 is regularly and consistently teaching, that increases the evidence that what you're looking at is a doctrine and not simply a teaching, a personal opinion of one person or the other. And so, again, that's something that's verifiable. We can go take a look and say, okay, here's a teaching who's been talking about it and how have they been talking about it? And so we've got two criteria that are very, any member of the church can go and begin to use those. And then the third one might be the most esoteric, the concept of salvific. In other words, it's not how many steps a Jewish person could take in their day. We would call that a policy or practice. But is this a teaching that is necessary for salvation? I don't know if we'd say growing a garden fits that, but we would definitely say eternal marriage fits that. What I found is if we combine those three, don't separate, subdivide. Mm-hmm. If we look and ask, is it eternal, or is it being claimed to be eternal and hasn't changed? Is it being taught regularly by the First Presidency and Quorum of 12? And is it a teaching that is necessary for our salvation? Putting those three together is a profoundly helpful way to begin to gain confidence that, okay, this is a teaching that isn't just good for our day, but one that I can have confidence isn't going to change. And Ryan, that becomes kind of one of the biggest issues here. One of the things that our youth and our members are trying to figure out is, okay, if something in the past was taught and then something changes, how do I know if what's being taught now might change? Those three criteria give us three explicit means by which we can look and say, not likely that's so. Jesus is a Christ. I think if you take a look at that, this is not going to be a hard battle to fight, to say, okay, is that an eternal doctrine? Has it been taught the same, that we depend on the Savior for our salvation? Is it taught regularly by the First Presidency and Quorum of 12? Is it salvific? We go, okay, I've got great confidence that Jesus being the Savior and our dependence on him will not change. That same process can be used with any topic. And it doesn't mean that we have a kind of a mathematical formula that we can say, okay, if A, B, and C adds up to this, we know that. But it provides increasing levels of surety, witnesses, multiple witnesses that what is being taught is something that we can have confidence in.
I love this kind of three, not three steps, but these three filters to use as we approach doctrinal teachings, as we approach concepts, as we're studying topics, etc. And it sounds wonderful, and it sounds like, okay, I can do that. I can make that decision, and that will really help me identify the things that I can, hang my hat on. I'm guessing, though, it's not always that easy. So maybe walk through with us. What do you do when it becomes muddy? What do you do when it becomes messy? How do we use what you're providing, which I think is really helpful, with some things that don't feel quite that clean?
Thank you. Really, really important here, because, again, I don't believe this is an algebraic formula. It's not a mathematical formula. Life is just a smidge more complicated than that. So let me give you a couple examples. We absolutely, positively believe that the atonement of Jesus Christ is a doctrine of the church, eternal, taught regularly, and salvific, correct? So we know the atonement it fits perfectly with what the brethren are saying is a doctrine. We also know that there are multiple theories, both scriptural, prophetic, and secular, as to how the atonement happened. We also know that the atonement is made up of, at least partially, practices or actions. So Christ did something in a specific place and a specific time. And so if you put all that together, you say, okay, but if it's got practices, does that mean it's not a doctrine? Or if this prophet thought it worked this way and that prophet thought it worked that way, does that mean it's not a doctrine? And that's where we have to be honest with the amount of material we can have confidence in. We know we are dependent on Christ's atonement, whether it's substitutionary atonement or penal atonement or whatever the theory is. We don't have as much confidence in that, so we wouldn't claim that to be doctrine. But the fact that we don't know how it works doesn't change the fact that we know not only does it work, it's necessary. Another simple example, plan of salvation, just keeping it big, the creation. We know that scriptures and prophets have taught from the beginning that God was the creator. We know that has been taught regularly by First Presidency and Quorum of 12 forever, and that we can't be saved without being created and the earth being created. So we go, great, we've got a doctrine. How God created the world, how God created us. We don't have that kind of surety. We have a lot of thoughts, and some of those thoughts are for sure true. Some of them are for sure not. And so we basically look at how would I put this? What can we have confidence in based on those three criteria? I don't have confidence in the how of the creation because they don't fit those three criteria. I have tremendous confidence in the creation, God being the creator, and our need for that for our salvation. So basically, it helps us to be careful not to overgeneralize, helps us be careful not to overclaim. And that's true not just for big picture things like the plan of salvation, but aspects of sexuality and gender and word of wisdom and other things. We can take a look and say, look at those three criteria. How does it fit? How does it work? What can we claim? What shouldn't we claim? And by doing that, it enables us to basically establish firm ground under us. And I'd add one more thing. I don't want to conflate truth and doctrine. All doctrine is truth, but not all truth is doctrine. Policies, for instance, policies can be revealed directly from God. God can say, I want this done and I want it done now. But next generation, he might say, I don't want. So if you are a Jewish individual back in the days of Moses or even in the days of Christ, the way you would commemorate the atonement would be to take a little lamb and slice its throat and put it on an altar and burn it. And that became a practice with which we would commemorate and bind ourselves to Christ. Christ came and said, we're not going to do that kind of sacrifice anymore. So now we do what we would call the sacrament. That change was brought about by God. So we wouldn't say the move from sacrifice to sacrament is not true because it changed. We would simply say it was a policy or a practice to start with. And so I think we got to be really careful not to claim simply because something is changeable that it's not true. But by being able to look at what is unchangeable, it gives us the foundation. So for instance, the atonement is the founding doctrine of the sacrament or the sacrifice. It's the atonement that doesn't change. The practice may and sometimes has to change.
Since listeners of Why Religion are interested in high-quality gospel scholarship, I want to take this brief commercial break to highlight BYU Religious Education's YouTube channel and to encourage you all to subscribe and follow it. It is a wonderful resource of faithfully researched messages produced under the direction of BYU Religious Education, and it has a wide variety of videos available. For example, you can watch all of the BYU Easter Conference messages, the church history symposiums, the prospective missionary devotionals, messages from the BYU Student Symposiums, the annual Sperry Symposium, or now Come Follow Me Symposium, new roundtable discussions with BYU faculty on the Book of Mormon and the Doctrine and Covenants and church history, and many more videos. Just jump onto YouTube and type in BYU Religious Education to see all of these videos and subscribe to the channel to be alerted to new videos that are published and released by BYU Religious Education. We've been listening to Dr. Michael Goodman talk about his recent research publication, Oh, Say What is Truth? Approaches to Doctrine, published in BYU Studies. In part 2 of Why Religion, we like to explore a little bit more why this research matters, how can it help inform us in living, learning, or loving aspects of the restored gospel of Jesus Christ. In this part, Professor Goodman takes us into his study of articles on frameworks or systems that scholars have developed to define and talk about church doctrine over the years. He will also provide 2 simple ways from his research to determine doctrine and give some takeaways for us as gospel teachers of church doctrine.
The next section you shift to, so that was all, this is what I've seen in General Conference. This is how our leaders are talking about it. The next section you approach several, I think, helpful models that have been presented by various scholars. And for consistency, I'll just reference them by title as you articulated in this article, and then just kind of let you walk us through each one. So the first, you just put from most to least authoritative. The second, sustained as official or canonical. The third, authoritative sources in line with current prophetic leadership. The fourth, a hermeneutic approach. And then finally, from core to esoteric teachings. So I think it'd be helpful for our listeners if maybe you just talk a little bit about these models that you've beautifully synthesized.
So before I did the systematic study of the words of the prophets, I wanted to see what others that I respect and know of have said about doctrine. And so I began to look for systems by which we can understand and interpret doctrine. And these were some of the major ones. I'm not saying that they're the only ones, but probably some of the largest ones. I'll just put it that way, right? The first one it was actually articulated by Armand Moss. And his system kind of... most of the other systems that you see are going to have some connection to what Armand put together. What he's doing is basically most to least authoritative. His version of that is most authoritative is canonized material, so basically Scripture. Next is official teachings of the First Presidency and Quorum of 12. Next would be teachings by other authoritative people, 70s and others who we would generally put confidence in. And his least was what he calls popular doctrine. In other words, it's folklore, largely, right? And so his system, like almost all the rest of them, is based on the concept of what's the source of the teaching. It's not analyzing the teaching, but the source of the teaching. It's basically the second of the three criteria that the brethren are using, which is First Presidency and Quorum of 12 as that source. But is it scriptural? Does it come from the brethren? And so that became an important touch point. And I don't think Armand made it up. If you go to General Conference and you go to the Words of the Prophets, they regularly speak of scriptures and modern prophets as here's your two sources. So using sources is certainly not wrong, but it perhaps doesn't give you quite as much information as many members may think it does. Let me explain as I go forward. Yeah. The second approach came from Stephen Robinson, and his was really simple. I have a graphic in there. Basically, it's a check mark. Is it canonical or not? He basically says, is it scriptural or not? If it is, great. If it's not, it's not doctrine. Now, there's something to that. Harold B. Lee and several others spoke of the scriptures as our touchstone for truth and for doctrine. And yet, as it will be true as we're talking about the next few, we know that the scriptures contain more than doctrine. The scriptures contain a history, contain poetry, contain writings of prophets, contain writings of historians. So we wouldn't say, by virtue of something being in the scriptures, it is therefore doctrine. But I think what these systems are trying to get at is that becomes a touch point. That if it is in the scriptures, that gives us a hint that it might be doctrine. Does that make sense?
Yeah, definitely.
Third one, Robert Millett, one of our old deans and dear friends. His is quite similar to Armand Moss's with a little twist. He goes most conservative or most authoritative is the standard words, scriptures, so very similar. Next is official declarations, very similar again. Then he puts in General Conference, basically First Presidency and Quorum of 12, and taught in a formal setting. And then he puts in handbooks. What's in the church's handbooks at this point? And one of the things that Brother Millett does that the others don't focus on as much is he talks about what is currently being taught. He prioritizes what the current and modern prophets are teaching. The fourth one, Nathan Ullman's, is by far the most esoteric, but it kind of fits the. Well, he's a lawyer, and what he's doing is basically using case law and precedent. And he's not saying this is the way you should determine what is doctrine. He's saying this is the way members do determine doctrine. So what he's using in his system is we hear some new teaching or some teaching, and to know whether we think it's doctrine is we compare it to what he calls easy cases. The atonement, Jesus Christ, something that is as basic and easy as possible. And then we look and see how close is that. And we basically decide based on precedent. Do we think this fits with precedent? If it does, we call it doctrine. If it doesn't, we don't. And then the last one, which is one of our more recent ones by some of our dear friends and colleagues, Anthony Sweat, Michael McKay, and Garrett Dirkmatt, is almost a picture of Armand Moss's. It's based on the concept of more authoritative to less authoritative. And the way they break it up is to look at core or what they call core or eternal doctrine, which kind of fits with the number one of what the brethren are doing right now. Then they call the next level supporting doctrine, which is basically doctrine that teaches about those core issues. Then they talk about what they call policy doctrine, which is more on the here and the now. And finally, they call it esoteric, which is what Armand Moss calls popular. And so again, it's most to least authoritative, and it largely focuses on source. Where does it come from? But theirs is one of the first ones to actually look at substance too. They're not just looking at the source, so they're looking at the eternality of it and things like that. And so taking those together, what I came to see was that each one of them contains parts and pieces of what the First Presidency and Quorum of 12 are doing. Largely with a focus on source, but towards the end beginning to look at, okay, it's more than where it comes from. Because we would, just like with the scriptures, we would say in General Conference, they teach eternal truths. They also tell fun stories. They also tell about activities and actions. And so just because something was in General Conference doesn't make it doctrine. Probably ups the possibility of it a little bit more. Just like if it's in the scriptures, doesn't make it doctrine, it lays the possibility for it.
Yeah, those are really helpful, and I think I think we're going to include a link to your article on the website for this, and then people can see the sources for these, and if they want to look more, they can go and explore each of these. But that was a wonderful summary. In the final section of the article, you talk about two final ways of determining doctrine that are continually emphasized by leaders and members alike, and they are, first, the witness of the Holy Spirit, and then second, the utilitarian concept of knowing by doing.
Yes.
Talk to us about that.
All right, and I'll reverse those if I can.
Okay,
just for the sheer fun of
Yep.
it. Utilitarianism is basically you're going to know a truth by doing. What it is basically John 7:17. So Christ said, you'll know of the truth of what I'm teaching by trying that truth. And the brethren are very, very, and sistren are very consistent in teaching us that one of the best ways that we'll know truth is to try it. If you want to know if tithing's true, try it. If you got to be careful not to do that with the opposite. If something's evil, you're not wanting to try that to figure out if it's evil. But if
that was an important note there.
A very important note. There you go.
Thank you for adding that. Lest you be confused, my friends out there.
But we want to. Well, I kind of came up with it as I was looking at the word doctrine. Again, over 2,000 references in the last 30 plus years. I was looking at what are called collocates of it. What words are said with the word doctrine? Well, it won't surprise you if I say the word covenants is one of the most common, obviously because of doctrine and covenants. Yeah. And I looked at several of these, and what I found was weather, not the wind and the rain, but whether something is this or whether something that. That was the third most common category of collocate. And I thought, what in the world's that? And when I went and looked at it, dozens and dozens and dozens of John 7:17 versions, whether I speak of myself or whether it comes from God. So this concept of if you want to know truth, one of the best ways is to try it. So that's utilitarianism.
Sort of this, prove all things and hold fast that which is good.
Exactly. And everything we're talking about has a strength and a weakness. This is really good. So if I do it and it has good outcomes, wonderful. That gives me some evidence. Having said that, the fact that I do something and enjoy it, or that it has short-term goodness, quote unquote, it's a little bit sketchy because sometimes we have to look at the longer picture. So utilitarianism is good, but I wouldn't put it as
limitations.
It has its limitations. And then last but not least, it shouldn't surprise you if we believe that God is the source of all truth and that he reveals truth, not just to prophets, but to us. That revelation is the constant clarion call. Think of President Nelson. He's pleading with us to get better at hearing the voice of God, to seek our own witness of the truths of what is being taught. And so that is without a doubt the most common criteria that the brethren are using, which is, if you want to know if it's true, go ask the source of truth. And we would say that's the end-all, be-all. We'd also say that that's a challenge as we're learning, because we would basically say that God is the perfect revealer. We're not always the perfect receiver. And so there's challenges to that also. But if we took what the First Presidency and Quorum of 12 are emphasizing, these 3 points, eternality, First Presidency and Quorum of 12, salvific, if we took those as criteria, and then we added to them the concept of, I'm going to try these things and I'm going to ask the Lord for guidance. I'm not just doing that blindly. I now have criteria that I can use to look and say, does this fit with what the First Presidency and Quorum of 12 are saying doctrine is? If it does, and I try it myself, so I pray and I exercise faith and I do what is being taught, we have the greatest possibility of noticing, recognizing, and learning to love truth and doctrine.
If you're interested in reading all of Professor Goodman's article, "Oh, Say What is Truth? Approaches to Doctrine," published in BYU Studies, we've provided a link to the full text of the publication on our website at yreligion.byu.edu. Again, that's yreligion.byu.edu. There you can also find out more about Professor Goodman and his research interests and background. And if you've enjoyed listening to Professor Goodman, I'd encourage you to listen to his prior Why Religion episode that he did along with the RSC's Devin Jensen, called Joseph Smith's Growing Understanding of the Eternal Family, episode number 24. It's a really great listen if you haven't heard it. Okay, we've arrived at our last segment, part 3 of Why Religion, where we like to discuss things a little bit more personally with the professor. As we conclude this interview, Professor Goodman gives us 1 or 2 things that he hopes listeners take away from the work that he's done on this subject and his own beliefs about church doctrine.
With the work that you've done here and these models that you've unpacked and the research that you've done looking at the talks from General Conference over the last 30 plus years, I'm curious if there was 1 or 2 things that you hope listeners take from the work that you've done. What would you say?
Well, I've largely focused on what I will refer to as the easy cases today. We've talked about atonement and Christ. The areas where most of our membership are struggling are some of the more hot button issues. Many of those revolve around the concept of eternal family. That's my PhD. That's where I spend the majority of my time at BYU teaching and researching. And so I regularly have students asking me, what can I have faith in? What won't change? How can I know that what President Nelson and President Oakes and President Eyring are teaching right now is the Lord's will and word? And one of the things that we're seeing, and we're seeing it with some of the research out there, is that as members begin to question whether they can have faith in the utterances of prophets, seers, and revelators, that begins to erode at their foundation of the possibility that they even know that Jesus is the Christ. And so what I want to do is give my students and members and friends and loved ones tools they can use to know for themselves. It's not simply, this person said it, therefore you should believe it. The Lord doesn't do that. He's given us helps. He's given us criteria. And so with my students, when they come to me with an issue, same-sex attraction, gender dysphoria, whatever the issue is, I can say, okay, well, let's take a look at each aspect of this using the criteria that the First Presidency and Quorum of 12 are regularly and consistently teaching. What I found is, as I do that with my students, I can walk them through and help them learn that, you don't have to trust Brother Goodman. You don't have to trust any teacher. You can know for yourself by using the tools that Heavenly Father has put in place to allow us to do that. And that allows each of us to have a far firmer foundation when it comes to our faith.
I love that, and I love one of the quotes that you used in this article, and this is from Elder Bednar, where he says, "A gospel doctrine is a truth of salvation revealed by a loving Heavenly Father. Gospel doctrines are eternal, do not change, pertain to the eternal progression and exaltation of Heavenly Father's sons and daughters." And you can see some of the language that you used earlier. Doctrines such as the nature of the Godhead, the plan of happiness, the atonement of Jesus Christ are foundational, fundamental, comprehensive. And then he makes this statement, and this is why I'm bringing it up. The core doctrines of the gospel of Jesus Christ are relatively few in number. And the reason that I share that is my experience has been, and I'm guessing is probably yours too, that some of the more challenging questions that we have and some of the things that lead individuals to struggle with faith come from confusing perhaps what is a practice or policy that you mentioned earlier
Exactly right.
with this idea of doctrine, where something may be cultural or maybe a current practice or function within a local area, a geographical area. That doesn't mean it's a core doctrine that what you were saying earlier we can hold on to. And so it seems like as we understand some of the things that you're talking about against the backdrop of Elder Bednar saying there are some things that you can have confidence in that are unchanging. And as we build a foundation on those things, then some of these other things
fall into place.
Exactly. And
yeah. The church, I used to say on LDS.org, now churchofjesuschrist.org, actually has a list of 9 quote-unquote basic doctrines. I would recommend our listeners go take a look at that. It's not hard to find. Google LDS Church Basic Doctrines. And that will give you I'm not in it now. Let me back off. I'm not saying that those are the only doctrines. I believe that there's more than that. But those are foundational and fundamental. Once we understand that, it gives us the confidence that, okay, I'm going to build from this base. If they're saying, for instance, one of them is commandments and ordinances, one of them is the plan of salvation, one of them is the Godhead, one of them is the eternal family, one of them is prophets and revelation. And so when I'm looking at my issues, one of the things that is helpful is to think, okay, how does it fit in with these basic doctrines? If it fits, well, you've got a pretty good, solid, okay, I got something to work with here. If it doesn't, I wouldn't exclude it. I wouldn't say ignore it or it's not true, but perhaps it may or may not be considered as core or basic. And at that point, I would strongly encourage all of us to go look at what the First Presidency and Quorum of 12 are continuing to teach right now. There's a little Brother Millet-ism right there. And so what are they teaching now? Does it fit with that? And then, again, apply those 3 criteria, and it's amazing what can happen. Again, it's not a algebraic formula. Oh, my goodness, I have just found that it helps my students so very much.
Yeah, really practical filters that we can use. And with that, and trying to think through, some application of what you've described here, a lot of our listeners have callings, responsibilities where they're teaching something.
Yes.
So I'm curious, what would you say, and you didn't really get into this a lot of it has pedagogical implications, but you don't unpack it in this article.
Yeah.
What would you say would be some pedagogical implications for our listeners?
A couple things I think are crucial. One is it behooves us not to teach false doctrine.
Yeah.
That sounds simple, but I was a mission president in Thailand, and so I've been deeply involved with missionaries, missionary discussions. I've been on general committees for the church on it, and one of the things that I learned for myself was that as a missionary, I taught false doctrine. Not on purpose.
This is a safe space, Brother Goodman. You can confess anything really out there if you need.
And what I found was that continues to happen. For instance, I lost my angel mother to cancer a few years ago, but just before that, I actually had the sister missionaries teaching her. And they were wonderful, fantastic, some of the best missionaries. And yet I sat there and listened to them teach some things that...
Kind of cringing a little bit.
Nope, not that one. And so I'd start as a teacher by saying, we want to make sure ourselves that we're solid on what we're sharing, that we're not speculating, that we're not going off onto the
esoteric
stuff or doctrinal tangents. And so we want to know that, one, we're solid. Two, the concept of don't just give people fishies, teach them how to fish. As teachers, as gospel teachers, we want to help our students, those that we love, those that we work with, learn how they can recognize truth and doctrine. Again, kind of what they can hang their hat on, what they can have confidence on. That's most effectively done as we give them the tools that help them to access what Heavenly Father has made available through prophets, through revelation, through experience.
Thank you for listening to Why Religion. This podcast is a production of religious education at Brigham Young University in Provo, Utah. My name is Anthony Sweat, the host and producer. The Why Religion podcast team also includes from BYU Religious Education, Jared Halverson, Ryan Sharp, Hank Smith, Beverly Yellowhorse, Elena Wainsgard, and Brad Wilcox. Recording, mixing, and original music was done by BYU student Mitchell Bashford. Say hi, Mitchell.
Hey, guys.
Original music and scoring for Why Religion podcast was also created by the fabulous BYU student musicians Grant Cagle,
Sam Clausen,
Colette Jones,
and
Alistair Scheuermann.
If you enjoy what you've heard, please like and subscribe to Why Religion on wherever you get your podcasts and leave us a rating. It really helps. And join us next time as we continue to bring the everyday Latter-day Saint fascinating gospel studies done by Brigham Young University religion professors to enlighten your mind and strengthen your faith.